Probably for as long as I can remember, since I was, 7 years old, maybe 8, I was interested in ancient Egypt. And I grew up in, well, a little town just outside Seattle, Washington, where, needless to say, there were very few opportunities to do anything Egyptological. Our library, I believe, had 2 books on ancient Egypt, plus the encyclopedia, and that was it. But I was fascinated by ancient Egypt. Oddly enough, not by any other archaeological sites. I didn't care about Greece or Rome or the Inca or the Maya. It was always a focus on Egypt. And from the age of 8 or 9, I knew that I was going to be an Egyptologist when I grew up. By the luck of the draw, great good fortune, I had a series of teachers, particularly in junior high school and high school, who encouraged that interest, and 2 in particular who themselves were amateur Egyptologists and had a small collection of Egyptology books that they would lend me. And I had parents who were encouraging. They didn't try to dissuade me from Egyptology and insist I go into insurance or shoe selling or what have you, because you couldn't make any money doing Egyptology. I did have an aunt who thought that, but fortunately she was in the minority. And all of my friends in school thought Egyptology was a great idea. I mean, my God, gold and jewels and mummy and exploration. I mean, this was pre-Indiana Jones, but the romantic appeal of archaeology in Egypt was still there. And so I was constantly my interests were constantly being reinforced. And when I got to university, I, again, was committed to doing Egyptology. I went to the University of Washington as an undergraduate. There was no Egyptology. But again, by great good fortune, there was a good program in archaeology and a good program in classics. And I studied both, major in anthropology. As a senior, I realized that if I was going to stay at UW, and financial reasons dictated to a large extent that I do so for another year or 2, I was going to have to do something that, even if it wasn't Egyptological, would help me in an Egyptological career. And one of the other things that interested me was the history of medicine. University of Washington had a very good medical school. And again, by great good fortune, there was a professor in the physiology department there, Robert Rushmer, who was an amateur Egyptologist. And he encouraged me to do basically a lot of pre-med courses. And so while I was an undergraduate, I had done Greek, French and German, anthropology, archaeology of all sorts, history, whatever I could find that would be of, I thought, use in archaeology, Egyptology. And in the medical school, he encouraged me to take classes in gross anatomy and pathology and history of medicine and so forth, which I did. In my second year of graduate school, I was then working toward a master's degree. I heard about the Nubian Salvage Program, and read that Yale University was planning to do a series of projects in Nubia, jointly with the University of Pennsylvania. And I wrote them and said that I was an archaeology major at the University of Washington. I had done a lot of medical history, anatomy, and so forth. I knew bones, I knew paleopathology, and would there be a chance for me to join their expedition? And I got a very nice letter back from William Kelly Simpson at Yale saying, "You're just the kind of guy we're looking for. Send me a couple of letters of recommendation, we'll see what we can do." And so I had a couple of my professors, particularly Walter Fairservice, send letters to Kelly, and Kelly wrote back and said, "Your ticket is in the mail. We'll meet in New Haven and then head out." I had had some archaeological experience before going out to Egypt. I had worked on some American Indian sites on the Columbia River. That was a salvage archaeology project. They were building a new dam on the Columbia River, and we were excavating in western Washington state before the dam was completed. And we had done a fair amount of excavation there. So I learned basic methodology of New World archaeological techniques, recording, excavating, stratigraphic analysis, this kind of thing. And the first archaeological project I worked on in Egypt was at Armina West. And there we were excavating a site, that, actually 2 components of the same site. One was a large and very impressive Meroitic pyramid field. Pyramids, but the first 1 or 2 courses only were preserved. And I worked on that with Aubrey Trick from the University of Pennsylvania, who had been the field director in Guatemala at Tikal for the Penn project there, a very, very good field archaeologist. And he taught me an incredible amount about archaeological work and put me also in charge of excavating a Christian town site adjacent to the Meroitic Pyramid field at Armina. And there I had my first brush with mud brick architecture, which was something that would hold me in good stead, certainly at Hierakonpolis, and well, later on at numerous other excavations throughout Egypt. The work at Armina was very fulfilling. I enjoyed every minute of it. Obviously, I was in heaven. This was my first experience digging in Egypt, something that I had wanted to do since I was 7 or 8 years old. And the knowledge that I gained there, the experience I gained there, thanks to Aubrey and Kelly, was to pay big dividends later on. It also helped when I went to Jabalada, and there I was working with Nick Millett of the American Research Center. And the first year as an archaeologist, the second year I was Nick's assistant director. And we were working on a town site, a so-called citadel, a very large early Christian capital city, major religious center in southernmost Egypt, excavating mud brick walls, a lot of occupation debris. It was my first really serious brush with pottery. We had had pottery at Armina, but not in the quantity, nor in the complexity of types that we got at Gebelada. So I worked on that, and of course there was also a Meroitic cemetery adjacent to the citadel down at the base of the hill. And we did some work there too, finding a lot of material, a lot of textiles. And in fact, it's from that site that, and from some dynastic material from Armina that constitute a very substantial amount of the collection that's now on display in the Nubian Museum in Aswan. And I remember going into the Nubian Museum for the first time many years ago with my wife, and looking around it, it was like going through the storeroom at Jabalada, because I would say, oh yeah, I remember that. There's the Ushabti of Hekonefer from Armina. My wife Susan would say, yes, I remember this piece of embroidery. We found this in cemetery such and such at Jabalada. She had come out the third year of archaeology, also from Seattle. And after the first season at Jabalada, she and I were married and continued our joint love affair with archaeological work in Egypt from then on. What excitement. I mean, here I was, a kid, I think I was 20 years old at that point. I'd never been out of the state of Washington, getting on an airplane, TWA, flying in the long circuitous route that was required in those days. And I think I went from Seattle to Chicago to St. Louis to New York, up to New Haven, back to New York, and then from New York to the Azores, Lisbon, Madrid, Rome, Athens, and Cairo. Got off the airplane, absolutely enthusiastic, excited, exhausted, of course, but because it was basically a straight flight, and checked into the Garden City House Hotel, which is where all archaeologists, at least all American archaeologists, started their career. Went to bed, woke up in the middle of the night with excruciating pains, and almost literally crawled, bent double to the American embassy, which was 2 blocks down the way the next morning, seeking medical help because this pain didn't go away. I was sent to a doctor, Dr. Abdullah Mishrik, in fact, who immediately diagnosed acute appendicitis, and I was rushed to a hospital in Abbasiyah, the Dar al-Shifa Hospital, where they immediately performed an emergency appendectomy. And I was in the hospital for a couple of days. In the meantime, the rest of the Yale crew had headed south to Aswan, and Kelly had said, when you leave the hospital, just fly down and join us, and we still have a few days of waiting in Aswan before we sail, so you won't have any problem. After a few days in the hospital, I got on the airplane, flew to Aswan, went out. Kelly's crew at that time included a number of Yale students, including several guys who were members of the Yale swim team. And they said, here's our golden opportunity. Let's go for a moonlight swim in the Nile. And I said, I'm for that. So we all dove into the Nile, none of us realizing how strong the currents were. They were award-winning swimmers, had no problem at all. I pulled my stitches and had to go to the clinic in Aswan. Went into the clinic, the doctor wasn't there, but there was a male nurse, and he says, I have to give you an injection. I said, okay. I had no idea what it was going to be, but it sounded like something sensible to do. So he gave me an injection. I immediately passed out and fell on the floor. And I remember coming to, I don't know how many minutes later, with this guy, beautiful Nubian face, looking me in the eye, saying, sorry, no problem, no charge. And I was taken by my buddies back to the dahabeah on which we were going to live in Nubia, and we made our way south. I mention all of this because the first archaeological site I saw, since I didn't get to do any sightseeing in Cairo or anywhere else, the first major archaeological monument that I saw was Abu Simbel. We had sailed for 3 days up the Nile. Abu Simbel was our first port of call. Kelly wanted us to see it before we went to Armina, which was where we were going to be digging. And I spent the first night with a couple of other guys on the project, sleeping in sleeping bags in the unguarded, unprotected, unlocked entrance to the big temple at Abu Simbel. And I remember waking up at sunrise the next morning to what must have been the most spectacular sight that this little kid from Seattle, Washington had ever seen. Ramesses II somehow was in my blood from that point on. Anyway, I went back to UW after that season, finished my MA, applied to University of Chicago and to Yale for graduate studies. I was accepted to both places, but I thought Egyptology at Yale would be better because Chicago was not particularly interested in doing field work. Keith Seeley was working in Nubia at that time, but it wasn't for the beginning students to be concerned about. Kelly, on the other hand, said, yeah, you come to Yale, no problem, we'll get you into the field as often as we can. And so I was accepted to Yale, went to Yale. I didn't get a fellowship from Yale, but I made application for a fellowship to the National Institutes of Health, because obviously I had had all this medical history training, and so I applied to do field work in paleopathology in ancient Egypt and to work on a doctorate in ancient Egyptian medicine. And I am proud to say that I think I am the only person ever to have a National Institute of Health fellowship in Egyptology. And it lasted me throughout my graduate career at Yale. Each year we went out. I was another season at Armina with Kelly. Then I went to work with Nick Millett at Armina, which was a National Geographic /ARCE project. From then on, I continued taking classes at Yale and working on my thesis, but I continued doing field work every year. From Gebel Ada, I was a season at Mendes with Don Hansen, and then Walter Fairservice was working at Hierakonpolis, and I went back and did my thesis at Yale on ancient Egyptian anatomical terminology, thereby satisfying the National Institutes of Health that I was in fact doing medical history. I did a lot of medical history courses at Yale too. They had a very good department. Got my doctorate at Yale, and that's my academic career up to the point I got my PhD. Walter Fairservice had, with whom I had studied at the University of Washington, again, because there were funds available through the Smithsonian Institution's PL 480 project, Public Law 480 monies being made available for salvage archaeology in Egypt. He made application through them and through NSF and got money for the University of Washington to have an expedition at Hierakonpolis, Kom el Ahmar, and I joined that expedition after finishing two seasons or three at Gebelada. That project had wound down, and I went off and worked with Fair Service for the next year, the next 2 seasons at Hierakonpolis. That was a very exciting project. Hierakonpolis is a huge site. It divides itself into several parts. There are a whole series of pre-dynastic settlements and cemeteries off in the desert. There's a so-called fort, whatever it may be, a funerary complex, perhaps of Khasachemwi. And then there is the town site, which is in the cultivation between the fort and the Nile River, which is about 1 kilometer away. And Walter wanted to deal with the pre-dynastic materials out in the desert, and I wanted to work on the settlement, the town site, in the cultivation. And here again, what I had learned from Aubrey Trick and the kind of work I had undertaken with stratigraphic studies in earlier days in Washington State paid big dividends, because this was a site that was covered in Nile silt. It was lying in the floodplain, and it presented extremely complicated stratigraphy. Very, very interesting, very challenging, with a lot of interesting material embedded in it. We found a lot of pottery. We found the remains of what we believe to be early dynastic Old Kingdom town site. And we found what has been called the niched palace facade. That was the area of the town site that I had been working in, and it turned out to be a very elaborate pattern of niching that has often been labeled a palace facade for no particular reason that I ever could find, except that it looks like a serach, and was reported as such, I think, by Walter Emery among the first from his work at Sakkara. Anyway, we worked on the niched facade in this so-called palace, which is one of the first examples, actually, of finding a physical, real niched facade, rather than just seeing something represented in petroglyphs, rock inscriptions, or on stelae, or in the stone architecture of Sakkara. And that was a very, very exciting season. We found a lot of material, a lot of cylinder seal impressions, a lot of pottery, a lot of stone tools, many of them ceremonial, very elaborate flint knives, for example. I worked at Hierakonpolis for 2 years. Walter was there for both seasons. Mike Hoffman was there for both seasons. And then I went on to complete my thesis at Yale. Took time off to come to work at Mendes, which was the New York University expedition in the Delta, sites of Tel Robad, Tel Timai, which just recently, by the way, are being worked on yet again by, of all places, people from the University of Hawaii. That was also a very interesting site. And again, I was fortunate to have as my director a man who knew mud brick architecture backward and forward, and that was Donald Hanson from the Institute of Fine Arts, who had worked elsewhere in the Middle East, where excavating soaking wet mud brick embedded in soaking wet mud was sort of a way of life. And he taught me an enormous amount about how to excavate what I still to this day think was the most challenging archaeological project I ever confronted with. Finding mud brick walls in a mud brick matrix was extremely difficult. You would scrape a millimeter of soil away and let it dry in the sun long enough to indicate mud, which was just mud, from mud brick, which had straw temper or ground pottery temper in it and could be distinguished virtually only in that way. And that would allow you to basically track mud brick walls where, if you hadn't let the material dry for a day before excavating, again, you probably wouldn't even have noted it was there. It was painstakingly slow. I mean, literally a millimeter at a time over many, many days. But it was incredibly good experience, and we found, among other things, in the Nile Valley, in the, Nile Delta floodplain, traces not only of Greco-Roman and late dynastic buildings, but we found the first examples of Old Kingdom tombs, stone-built tombs at Mendes, beautifully decorated, just simply boxes, single boxes, four sides, monolithic pieces of limestone defining each of the four sides with a roof slab and a flooring slab, the interior walls of which were elegantly decorated. It was major work for a conservator, our photographer, and all the rest of it. But that was a very exciting project to work on. Again, working in mud brick, which was fun because it was so challenging, but then to find something that was so characteristic of Old Kingdom art, something that I had not encountered before. And that sort of shifted my interests from strictly an archaeological interest, an excavation interest, to looking at cemeteries like Giza and Sakkara, where obviously archaeological methodology took second place to the needs of conservation and epigraphic recording. But before that, yes, let's back up a little bit. Between Hierakonpolis and going back to Yale to work on the thesis, I continued doing coursework with Kelly at Yale and some classes in medical history, but I also worked at Sakkara. I was interested in doing studies of anatomical peculiarities in the representations of human figures in the Old Kingdom painting and relief in the mastabas at Sakkara. And I spent a season working with my wife and Susan and a couple of other artists whom we hired to go out and make recordings of this. We were looking for representations of achondroplastic dwarfs. We were looking for representations of people who were shown to have anatomical peculiarities, an elongated cranium, for example, or a withered arm, or a knee, which you see sometimes with herdsmen, a knee that seems to bend backward rather than bend in a normal way. Individuals who had protruding bellies, or what some have thought might be inguinal hernias. And we were looking through every accessible mastaba that we could find at Sakkara, just visually scouring the walls to try and find any peculiar representations. And we did. We found quite a number of them. These formed the basis for the MA thesis that I had done at the University of Washington before going to Yale. Note the chronological screw-up here in my babble. And I did my master's thesis at the University of Washington on the representations of achondroplastic dwarfism in Egyptian art, particularly in the Old Kingdom. This was, it's strange, a lot of people have worked on this since. David Silverman did an article on achondroplastic dwarfs, and there is a French Egyptologist who did a study of dwarfism from a more religious rather than a medical standpoint. She was interested in the association of dwarfs with the god Ptah, and published a book on that a number of years after I had done my thesis. Anyway, that was my first venture into non-archaeological Egyptology, and it was fun, and I enjoyed it immensely. And so after I finished my thesis at Yale, my doctorate at Yale, I was looking around for various projects to work on, and one thing that I thought would be great fun to do would be to find a mastaba that hadn't been published and record it. And I went up to the Museum of Fine Arts and spent several very, very enjoyable, very long afternoons with William Stevenson Smith. And I said, I know you've got all this unpublished Reisner material here from Giza. I've done some work on with epigraphic work, and I've done a lot of archaeology, and I'm wondering whether I might be able to be allowed to publish some of Reisner's unpublished tomb notes. I'd prefer something that would require some field work, not just publishing what Reisner had, but to go out and augment his notes with epigraphic recording of what he saw in the tombs, and perhaps even re-excavate the area where he had cleared the mastabas to see if there are still traces of architectural details or stratigraphy or what have you that we could add. And he said, oh yes, absolutely, you're welcome to do whatever you want. And he just set me into the storeroom and said, find your way and find something interesting. And I found all of Reisner's notes for what he called Cemetery G6000, which was a complex of mastabas belonging to a family, Imeri and Iti, Imeri, Neferbauta, Shepsiskafach, which was off to in the westernmost corner of the Great Western Cemetery to the west of the Great Pyramid. And so Bill Smith said, it's yours, go ahead and publish. And I applied to NSF and got a grant, and went out to Egypt and worked for 2 field seasons. I assembled a group of people, some of whom I had known in our work at Hierakonpolis or in my association with the American Research Center. I should mention that I had been a fellow of ARCE, and in fact, I think Jerry Bacharach said yesterday that I was the first Egyptological fellow that ARCE had, and I think that's true. And it was that ARCE fellowship that paid for me to be in Egypt and to do the work I had done for my master's thesis on achondroplasia and human representations at Sakkara. Now I had an NSF grant. I was working on Cemetery G6000 at Giza. I assembled a group of artists, again, my wife, who's an extremely good artist, Clara Semple, who had worked for a number of years with George Scanlon's excavations at Fostat, and who had worked with us at Hierakonpolis. Helen Basilewski, who was also an artist, a teacher at a private school in New York City, and who had been recommended to me, perhaps by somebody on Don Hanson's Mendes project, I think. And we all went out, and the goal was to record all of the reliefs and so forth in the tombs of Iti and the rest of the family that I'd mentioned, and to do a re-excavation of the cemetery so we could include all of the subsidiary tombs, pit tombs and shaft tombs and smaller mastaba tombs that were built in and around the major mastabas of the main family members. And we worked there for 2 summers. Elizabeth Rodenbeck, Buffy Rodenbeck, who just died a few weeks ago, from the American University in Cairo, is also a member of the project. And over the next several years, with the material we had collected, I began assembling a publication of Reisner's notes, to which we added a complete recording of all of the inscriptions and scenes on the tomb wall, and an examination of all of the objects that Reisner had recorded, some of which were in the MFA, some of which were in the Egyptian Museum, and some of which were still, strangely enough, in storage, scattered in various places at Giza. And Anthony Spallinger worked on the project the second year with us, and he did a lot of the epigraphic recording of the inscriptions that were in the tomb. And the result was a publication of Iti, Imeri, Neferbauta, and so forth, which I published, I don't remember the year now, but anyway, it was the second major publication that I had been able to do, the first being the publication of the material that I had been given charge of at Armena West. And that was part of the publications of the Penn Yale series. The Cemetery G6000 was one of the first volumes in the Giza Mastaba series that Kelly Simpson who at the time of publication, not at the time of my fieldwork, but at the time of publication was continued as professor at Yale, but who had also become curator in the Egyptian department at the MFA. And so it was published by them then. One of the things I did at Gebel Adem, because we had a number of cemeteries surrounding the citadel, was to examine the skeletal material that was coming out of the tombs. And we wound up, over the several seasons, with close to 5,000 human skeletons. And I had been looking through that collection of material for evidence of various pathologies, everything from fractures and sprains to arrowheads embedded in the arm bone, that kind of thing. And one of the things I was hoping to do was to take that skeletal material and do basically a study of the human remains from Jebel Adem. I was contacted early on in that by Jim Harris, who was a professor of orthodontics at the University of Michigan. And he said that he was very interested in doing studies of craniofacial growth and of dental pathology in large populations. And he said, is there any way we could collaborate, because you've got this huge collection of human remains from Gebel Adem, and you, I know, and he knew this because I had written about it in the ARCE newsletter, you have done all of the measurements on the skulls and skeletons. You've done photographs of all of the skeletal material, and you've noted all the pathological conditions. Could we now come in and do X-rays of all of the skulls so that we could do a detailed study of the dentition? And I said, that's a super idea. And so we collaborated, and over the next season or so, I went out to Gebel Adem and worked in the winter months, but I went back in the summer, the blazing heat of Nubian summer, and worked with a friend of mine and a Nubian cook and a dog at Gebel Adem. We were the only people there. It was, God knows, I don't know how many degrees in the shade. Nubia was unbearable. We had the simplest food and nothing but water to drink. And we sat under an awning and simply took measurements of skeletons all day. Jim Harris went out the next season with his team and in very timely fashion, X-rayed all of the skulls that we had. So we now had a very comprehensively documented collection of skeletal materials. The big problem was we didn't have the archaeological data. All of the notes that Nick Millett had taken and the other members of the team had taken, documenting the grave from which each of these skeletons came and the grave goods that were associated with them, all of that material was boxed and was being sent back to the States, along with a division of objects, some of which were destined for the National Geographic Society. And they were lost. They never made it. Some of the material is in Toronto, which is where Nick Millett went after leaving ARCE and Yale, but the material never showed up. And Nick has written a very apologetic note in the ROM newsletter about this. But all of the archaeological documentation for the skeletal material was lost, and so we don't know the date. There was nothing we really could do about publishing the anatomical material without a chronological framework, and that sort of put paid, at least temporarily, to what we could do with the publication plans until we found some way of reconstructing that material. I was approached by Eugene Struhal, who was an anthropologist and someone interested in Egyptology, a professor at Charles University in Prague, who had done a lot of work on anatomical materials in Egypt. And he said, if you aren't going to publish this material immediately, if you're waiting for the archaeological material, why don't you give it to me? I'll play with it. And when the archaeological material comes, either we can do a joint publication, or I'll give it all back to you, or you can give it to me, whatever seems appropriate at the time. So I gave him all of our material, the paleopathological and anthropometric material. And we were searching high and low. Nick was searching high and low, trying to find the archaeological data, which to this date has never materialized. And all the anthropometric data is at Charles University in Prague. And God knows when it will ever be published. I hope someday, but I am not holding my breath, alas. So, Jim Harris could not do anything either with the X-rays that he had, because that also required a chronological framework on which to place all of the skeletal material. But he said, you know, I have a neat idea. We've been looking here at a bunch of commoners, ordinary garden variety folk here in Nubia, over a period of probably at least 1,000 years. Wouldn't it be interesting, assuming that someday we get the archaeological data that will allow us to publish it, wouldn't it be nice at the same time to have a comparative collection of upper-class Egyptians for whom we could get information on dentition and health? And I thought that was a great idea, and what do you propose, I asked, and he said, well, the most obvious collection of known upper-class Egyptians is the collection of the royal mummies in the Egyptian Museum. Why don't we get permission to X-ray those? Which we did get. And we went to the Egyptian Museum, X-rayed all of the mummies. We set up a laboratory in the Nile Hilton Hotel across the street. The bathroom was our photographic darkroom. And we took X-rays of all of the mummies. It was from this that Jim Harris and his team were able then to re-examine the chronology of the royal mummies, because it turned out that some pharaohs that history said died young, maybe at the age of 25 or 30, were in fact skeletal remains of people who lived well into their 50s. There was a disjunction here between accepted chronology for royal reigns and the human remains of the pharaohs that are supposed to be those very royal people. There was a problem. And Jim Harris, I was working with other things at the moment, and I had written a couple of articles. In fact, I had written a popular book called X-Raying the Pharaohs about our work for that, Jim Harris and I, because we needed money to continue the work on the analysis of the skeletal material. And Walter Fairservice said, well, why don't you guys write a book about what you're doing, a popular book. I know people at Charles Scribner, the publisher, will get it published, and you take the royalties and you can apply the royalties to the next step of your research, which is what we did. And Jim and I wrote X-Raying the Pharaohs. We took the advance and used it for his further analysis of age at death of the royal mummies. Jim then tied in with Ed Wenty, who had been very interested in the project and in the royal mummy chronology problems, and began a re-examination of the age at death of the mummies in the Egyptian Museum. And this led to the reattribution of several mummies who we believe had been mislabeled, perhaps when their bodies had been moved around TT 320, where their mummies had been taken by, in order to prevent tomb robbers from damaging them. Maybe the name tags on the bodies got shifted or whatever. But in any case, they published a more technical report called X-Ray Atlas of the Pharaohs, in which this whole question of chronology was addressed. And that project is, in one sense, still continuing. We have the new, most recent publication by Dr. Zahi and colleagues, Scanning the Pharaohs, I believe it's called, in which they too have re-examined the whole problem of chronology. When I finished my doctorate at Yale, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with my life, except I knew it was Egyptology. But I went down to the Metropolitan Museum of Art one day and I had lunch with Henry Fisher, whom I had been in touch with several times in the past about questions when we were getting the cemetery G6000 material ready for publication. And I said to Henry, well, I've just got my doctorate from Yale, I'm just finished and I'm looking for a job. Is there anything at the Met? And he said, funny you should ask. My timing apparently was just absolutely accidentally perfect. Eric Young, who had worked with Henry as assistant associate curator at the Metropolitan Museum in previous years, had decided to leave the Metropolitan Museum and give it all up and become a cabinet maker in New Zealand. And so there was, in fact, an opening at the Metropolitan Museum, and Henry offered me the job. And so my first job out of graduate school from Yale was to move to New York. My wife and I took an apartment on the Upper West Side, and she, who had been working as an artist in the paleontology department at Yale, got a job in the paleontology department at the American Museum of Natural History. And she had worked with Elwyn Simons, who was one of the world's foremost paleontologists, who was specializing in the history of primates, and whose chief claim to fame was work in Egypt, where he had discovered the precursor, the forerunner of all primates, known appropriately as Egyptopithecus. So even there, my wife was involved in work in Egypt, although 30 million years earlier than what I was doing. So she worked on the west side at Natural History Museum. I worked on the east side at the Met. And she, I must admit, was not terribly happy with her work because her primary emphasis working at Yale on primates was the study of primate dentition, which is the single most important anatomical feature for paleontologists who were studying mammalian evolution. Her specialty was dentition. She worked for a man named Gene Gaffney, whose specialty was the history, the Paleolithic, prehistoric history of turtles. They don't have teeth. And it was very boring drawing just simple little bony plates. And she felt that the work was not what she had felt she had been trained to do. I was at the Met, and because Eric Young had left, about 6 months after I came, Henry called me in and said, I'm sorry to tell you this, I know it's going to be a shock to your system, but I've decided to leave the Met myself. I'm going to become the Lila Atchison Wallace consultative curator with no obligations in the department, and my wife and I are moving to upstate New York, where we have bought a farmhouse, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be around anymore. Well, that was a big loss for me because Henry was, I had incredible respect for Henry, both as a person and as an Egyptologist, and I had hoped I would learn a great deal about particularly Old Kingdom art from him. But I was in the museum now and sort of wandering about, not knowing quite what to do, and the museum itself was in a state of flux. I thought, I'm not terribly keen on museum work. I would rather be in the field. And in, again, great stroke of luck, discovered that there was an opening for someone to teach in anthropology and archaeology at the American University in Cairo. And I made application for that. I had my BA in anthropology, my MA in anthropology and archaeology, and a PhD in Egyptology. I thought, well, this will be a fine fit. And so I was hired at the American University, and I quit the Met and went to AUC. And delighted that I did, because it was at that point I was teaching at AUC, but it was during those first years of my employment at AUC that I was able to do, here's another chronological screw up. It was while I was in my first and second year at AUC that I was able to get that grant that allowed me to do the work on cemetery G6000. I had accumulated all the notes and so forth from Bill Smith prior to that time, but now I was in Cairo, based there basically 12 months of the year, and I could use AUC students as well as Clara Semple and the others whom I've already named as the staff members. And the field work at Giza could be a part of the AUC archaeology program. And AUC, at that time, the president was a man named Chris Thoron, who was a good friend of Kelly's, was an amateur Egyptologist himself, and who was very encouraging of me trying to set up a program in Egyptology at AUC, something they had not had before. And it seemed sort of a natural fit that we could take the anthropology program with its archaeological component and make that more specifically Egyptological. And the idea of there being a fieldwork project that students could participate in at a site close by, Giza, was a perfect natural. And so I suddenly found myself again in hog heaven. Now I was doing something I really, really liked, far more than I enjoyed museum work. I was in the field, I was doing excavation, I was doing Old Kingdom epigraphy, I was teaching, which I've always enjoyed doing, and I was in Cairo, and I had fallen madly in love with Cairo. So had my wife, who had been there before at Hierakonpolis and at Gebelada and at the other sites I had worked on. So everything just worked out well. We had had our first child by this point. He, at the time of our move, our son Chris was a year old. And so we were a young family just setting up house in Cairo. It worked out very, very well. And it was the beginning of the Egyptology program at AUC, which is now a well-recognized going concern with one of my early students, Salim Akram, who is in charge of it. While I was at AUC, the second or third year, I guess the second year that I was there, I was approached by Ed Wente from the University of Chicago, who came to me and said, I'm leaving Chicago House. I don't like being in Luxor particularly. I would rather be back in Chicago working in the library, and we desperately need a field director. Would you be willing to do this? And I thought, oh, gosh, I don't know really that much about Thebes, and I am certainly not an epigrapher of the caliber that Chicago House requires. And he said, you do what you want in terms of your own work. What we need is basically an administrator to run Chicago House, and somebody who can deal with grants and fundraising and keep the place going and keep it in tow and organize publications and all of that. And he said, keep in mind too, that the official title of Chicago House is the Oriental Institute Epigraphic and Architectural Survey. And so if you wanted to do a bit of archaeology while you're there, that isn't an impossibility. And so I went to Chris Choron, the president of AUC, and I said, look, I've been here only a couple of years, but I have this offer to take over the directorship of Chicago House, and I think I really should do it. But I want you to know that I still have a very soft spot in my heart for AUC, and if it doesn't work out, I'd like very much to come back. And he said, that's fine. You just make sure you can get somebody to cover your classes. And we went off to Chicago House. And for the next 4 years, I was director of the Oriental Institute's headquarters there. The one major change that I thought I should make, well, let me back up. Chicago House had a program of doing, as everyone knows, the most meticulous epigraphic recording. It is given the state of technology at that point, the most meticulous epigraphic recording it was possible to do. It was very time-consuming. So time-consuming, in fact, that the survey had, I think when I was there, had not published any of its work for about 12 or 13 years. There was a big gap in the publication record. And I thought, if one of my duties is to raise money for the project and to convince PL 480 and ARCE and private donors, more to the point, that they were going to have to contribute to this project, we were going to have to be able to show something rather than a publication every 12 years, or it just wasn't going to fly. And so I made a deliberate decision to change the way in which projects were identified at Chicago House. In the past, it was, let's do Medinet Habu Temple. Okay, it may take 80 some years. Indeed, it's taken longer, they're still there. But that was how the project was defined. It was no more specific than that. Or let's do Khonsu Temple. And the unwritten assumption was that all of Khonsu Temple would ultimately be done, and then the project would move somewhere else. And I thought maybe there is some way that we can have smaller, better defined projects, goals that could be achieved in, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years rather than 10 or 20 or 30. We could still do an entire temple. We could do, say, Medinet Habu, or we could do Khonsu, but let's define our proposals and our current goal as a series of discrete units. And so the first project I proposed that we do was the battle reliefs of Seti I on the outer face of the north wall of the hypostyle hall at Karnak. Nice, well-defined, very interesting from both an art historical standpoint and an historical standpoint. One of the finest examples of narrative art to be found anywhere in Egypt. And we defined the project as simply that. We're going to do this wall. And we began the work, and over a period of 3 years, we had completed it, found some very interesting material, sections of the wall that had not been seen before, that no one had noted for God knows how many centuries. We had found a lot of new information. Bill Murnane was the principal epigrapher, Egyptologist working on the project at the time, and he was put in charge of publishing the final record of it. And it meant that we got a good, fine publication out in very timely manner. The second project that I had suggested we do was the festival scenes in Luxor Temple. And there, again, it was the processional colonnade. It was one room in Luxor Temple rather than the entire complex. This was well defined. It had been published a long time before by Wolf in not a very satisfactory publication, but the quality of the work and the fact that there were a lot of blocks of the wall lying around in the area, I thought would make it a very interesting and very usable record, both from the standpoint of a study of a religious ceremony in Egypt, but also an example of Egyptian art from a very important period in the history of Egyptian art, and would presumably allow us to, if not physically, then at least on paper, reconstruct what the entire scenes in the processional colonnade looked like. So here again, we had a fairly discrete project that allowed us to come up with the final publication, or near final publication, in a matter of about 5 years. And I think it was a very well-received publication. A lot of new material came out of it. The next project was to continue the work that Ed Wente had, and Charlie Nims before him, had begun in Khonsu Temple. And here the idea was that we would do the first court, at least part of the first court of Khonsu Temple. Again, a well-defined project that would allow us to get publication out in timely fashion. Didn't preclude the possibility that we would ultimately do the entire temple, but again, we tried to define it in more manageable units, and so we turned our attention to Khonsu. And here again, this is a very critical period in Egyptian history, and Khonsu Temple is one of the principal monuments for gaining information about that period. We also did some, in a sense, cleanup work at Medinet Habu. And here again, Bill Murnane produced a magnificent work, which was his book. I had asked him if he would be interested in doing a semi-popular book on Medinet Habu. We had had people coming into Chicago House, tourists. There weren't very many in those days, but they were coming in and saying, we can't find anything about Medinet Habu. Baedeker doesn't tell us much of anything. And we had all this material, of course, 7 volumes, elephant folio volumes of drawings of the walls at Habu, and I suggested to Bill that if we could get photographic reductions of those drawings, we could produce a small-scale handbook of Medinet Habu with a description of the scenes and texts and so forth. It wouldn't be a popular guidebook in the sense that it's just a bunch of pictures with minimal text, but it would be a more comprehensive but manageable field guide that one could take out to the temple, and if one were seriously interested, go through and have the Chicago House drawings and an explanation of the scenes in front of you while you began looking at the walls. And Bill wrote the book United with Eternity, which was just exactly that. And we got AUC Press. We got the University of Chicago to agree to allow AUC Press to publish it, and which they did. And it turned out to be a very, very successful volume, both in terms of sales and in terms of the favorable reviews that it garnered. And I think that approach to Chicago House's work has continued under more recent directors. Ray Johnson, for example, is doing a series of projects at a number of different temples. He too has given a lot of emphasis to things other than simply epigraphic recording. The block museum, the display at Luxor Temple, and the one that is currently being done in Medinet Habu are 2 very good examples of that. And the work that they have been doing in the first court at Khonsu with the blocks under the floor, another good example of a more broadly based approach. I think in the long run, I think that it has helped make the work of the epigraphic survey more relevant in this day of conservation and interest in protecting monuments. And it has made more people more aware of the importance of Chicago House and the epigraphic work it's doing by making volumes much more accessible and having them come out in more timely fashion. In the 3rd year that I was at Chicago House, we had another child, and our son, Christopher, was of school age. And we had to make a decision as to what to do. We had several options. Susan could stay in Cairo, and Chris could go to school there, or she could stay in the States, and he could go to school there, but we'd be separated for 6 months of the year. Or he could go to a boarding school in England, which didn't appeal to us. Or we could have a nanny come, and a governess or whatever, and teach him in Luxor. None of these appealed. We tried the only other available option, and that was to enroll him in school in Luxor. And so he went to a school that had originally been the Carrie M. Buchanan United Presbyterian Mission Girls Boarding School. Even had a little uniform that he wore, Girls Boarding School written on it. It didn't seem to affect him in subsequent years. But the school had been sequestered by the Egyptian government. It was now part of the national public school system. And he was enrolled there in 1st grade. And we thought, well, let's see how it works. He'll learn Arabic, and this will be good. Well, we discovered early on that he was not terribly excited about going to school. And we discovered the reason was that during the two snack time breaks during the school day, each day, the teacher was locking him in a closet. And we asked what the reason for this was, and she said, well, your son has blonde hair, and all the children in the class are fascinated with this, and they go and they are constantly touching him and pulling his hair and so forth. And she says, the only way I could think to protect him was to lock him in the closet. Well, we thought this was not a particularly good pedagogical technique. And by the luck of the draw, I had been offered a post by Leonard Lesko at UC Berkeley. And this, we thought, might be a good solution to leave, reluctantly, Chicago House and Luxor. So if I were 2 years at Berkeley, I could, after 2 years, teach part of the year at Berkeley and the remainder of the year be in Cairo at AUC, administering the UC program, but also teaching there. And this seemed like a neat solution. It kept our ties with Egypt and with the American University, but it also meant that it would be an American pay scale, paid at the Berkeley salary rate rather than the AUC salary rate, which, believe me, there's quite a difference between the two. And it allowed us to have a place where our son could go to school. I'm not sure we made the, I was not the first week there sure that we had made the right decision when we rented a house in Oakland, on the Berkeley-Oakland border, and went to enroll Christopher in school. And the teacher said, everything is fine, this is all great, yeah, he can start school tomorrow. Please, however, remember that he is not allowed to bring any books or bags, any bags or backpacks or anything like that to school with him. And we said, that's very strange. Why is that? He can't even bring a lunch? She said, no, no paper bag, no lunch. Why is that? And she said, well, too many of our first graders we've discovered are bringing guns and knives into the classroom. Well, again, this seemed like maybe we hadn't quite done the right thing. About 2 months after we got there and had rented this house in Oakland, we broke our lease and moved to another place at a different school district. When I was at Chicago House, again, keeping in mind that the official title of Chicago House is the Epigraphic and Architectural Survey, I thought perhaps we could do some archaeological work, or at least archaeological type recording in addition to the epigraphic work. And I proposed that we might begin making an archaeological map of the West Bank, of Thebes, as the beginning of a project to develop a management plan. Tourism was slowly growing, but nevertheless growing during this time. This is the early and mid-70s. And I thought that if we didn't have a decent archaeological map, and there were no decent archaeological maps, it would be very difficult to do anything about site management or conservation because you didn't know where many of the things lay. And I proposed establishing a mapping project as a part of the UC epigraphic program. People at Chicago itself were not terribly enamored of this idea. They wanted it to be a strictly epigraphic program, similar to what had been done since the 1920s. And the idea that I had already implemented of doing a series of short-term projects rather than ill-defined, more grandiose projects, I think had used up most of the bartering power that I had, if I had any at all. But on my days off at Chicago House, I began experimenting with a friend, David Sims, who was a colleague at Yale and worked on at Abydos with Kelly, and who, although not himself a surveyor, had known enough about surveying that he and I could work together. And we tried making several maps of various areas in Luxor to get some idea about what would constitute a proper scale and how complex it would be and what sort of qualifications we would need for people whom we hired and so on. When I left Chicago House and went to Berkeley, I expanded upon this idea because one of the things that Berkeley had suggested was that they would like to have a field work component to their Egyptology program. And I was very enthusiastic about that. And I said, well, look, I've got this idea for a Theban mapping project, and I think this would fit right in. It would give the students an opportunity to learn a great deal about Thebes, and it would give them training, hands-on experience that would certainly hold them in good stead if they then went on to other projects later on, because to just want to go on an archaeological project is not enough. You can always get warm bodies. But to get somebody with a skill such as surveying, good knowledge in map making, really helps you get a foot in the door. And so Berkeley said, fine, but you have to raise the funds for it. So I made applications to NSF and got a grant to do this. And we began going out with our first season. We called it then the Berkeley Map of the Theban Necropolis, or the Berkeley Theban Mapping Project. And we went out and began our work. We chose the Valley of the Kings as the first place to do this map, partly because it was small and well-defined, not like the nobles' tombs or some of the temple sites that were incredibly complicated. It was well-defined, and also because we thought it would be fairly simple. The tombs were large, many of them were cleared, so we didn't have to fight our way through rubble and so forth and guess where corners lay. And there were also, of all the sites on the West Bank, the Valley of the Kings was the one where we could see the most noticeable increase in tourist numbers. And so we began our work there. And with all our Yankee know-how, as I said in the lecture the other day, we thought, oh, this is nothing, piece of cake. We'll get a map of the Valley of the Kings in no time, and then we can move on and do the rest of Thebes. I'd been fortunate to be introduced to, I was looking around for a surveyor, someone well qualified to do the work, and I was fortunate enough to be introduced to David Goodman, who at that time was the chief surveyor for the California Highway Department, and asked him, would you like to come to Egypt? Would you take time off from your Caltrans work and join our project? And he said yes. The best move we ever made. David Goodman was an absolute angel. He's just one of the nicest, kindest, most talented people you will ever meet in your life. He was beloved on the West Bank at Luxor by people. He's just, everybody adored him. There was no better qualified surveyor. He was a stickler for detail. He saw the need for us to train local people to help. He saw the need to do a comprehensive overlay, a grid network over the entire West Bank as the first stage in our work. He saw the need to do extremely detailed maps, plans of tomb interiors, far more elaborate and far more detailed than I would have thought necessary. And everything he did was absolutely spot on, and it has proved over and over again the value of his advice and surveying leadership on the TMP. David, by the way, went on to become, he continued working for us for, 6 or 7 or 8 years. He then went on and joined Mark Lehner at Giza and laid out the Giza Plateau Mapping Project, laid out a similar grid network there. And I noticed David just died, unfortunately, a couple of months ago, and a terrible loss. But I noticed that Mark Lehner has written a very, very nice eulogy of David in the latest aerogram. And it's an indication that in Giza, too, he became an absolutely indispensable, well-loved, highly qualified individual. Best thing that's happened to Egyptology in decades. So we began work in Luxor as a Berkeley project, and we took students out into the field each year. They learned surveying. Some of them learned extremely well. Catherine Rohrig was one of our first graduate students, became a first-class surveyor, worked very well with David Goodman, and I made her assistant director of the project almost by the end of the first season. She was extremely well qualified, very hardworking. And the result was that we began making very impressive progress. But the idea that our Yankee ingenuity was going to allow us to do the Valley of the Kings and publish an atlas of it in a matter of 1 or 2 years proved to be wildly off the mark. The ancient Egyptians, with their crude implements, had two things that we didn't. They had a great deal of patience, and they had a whole lot of time. We had short field seasons that had to fit into the academic year, and being Americans, we weren't patient. And the result was things took a lot longer than we had thought. And indeed, it was almost 16 or 17 years before the Atlas of the Valley of the Kings finally appeared. But when it did, thanks to people like David, it proved indispensable. And it's become, I think it's safe to say, it has become one of the most cited reference works when it comes to talking about architectural history or mapping or Thebes in Egyptology today. It's gone through 2 printings and 2 editions, and the 3rd one is on the way. The problem we encountered, however, after several years of work was that Berkeley, which about 3 years before I had gone there, had a student revolt. And the students demanded that the university quit the semester system and go on to the quarter system. This worked very well for us because Berkeley said, for your project, you can take 1 quarter and summer off. So we could work spring and all of summer, and we could have a long field season, and we could do it every year. A couple of years after I was at Berkeley, the students staged a revolt and said, you have to get off the quarter system and go on the semester system. And the university acquiesced and went back to the semester system, and Berkeley said, well, you can't take half the year, every year off. If you want to do field work, you can only go into the field once every other year, or you can only work in the summer. Well, we chose the latter, working only in the summer. But again, this slowed down the project a bit. When I went back and was working jointly with Berkeley and director of the Year Abroad program in Egypt, things were not so difficult. There I could take students from AUC as well as students from Berkeley, and we could go out and have an extended period. But that was only for a couple of years. Otherwise, we were stuck in this semester system quandary. Nevertheless, it all worked out. We had some very good people working on the project. And thanks to David and Catherine and some of the others, Joel Paulson, we, I think, produced a very, very good volume. In the process of our mapping in the Valley of the Kings, it was obvious that there were a number of tombs that, in a sense, had gone missing over the years. Tombs that we had records of in the journals of early travelers, but which were not visible today. And we thought, well, if we're going to do a comprehensive map of the Valley of the Kings, and if the idea is for this map to help protect its monuments, then we really should try to include as much as possible. If we can't locate a tomb today, at least let's try and put an approximate location for it on a map, or at least show the doorway. This problem came to a head during our mapping when it was clear that the Egyptian Antiquities Department was proposing to solve a traffic problem. As I said, tourism was increasing during these years in the mid-70s, late 70s in the Valley of the Kings. And this meant that there were more tour buses coming in. Now at that time, tour buses didn't stop down by a rest house. The tour buses drove all the way up to the Valley of the Kings and stopped just before you get to the tomb of Ramesses II. The problem was, once they stopped there and disgorged their passengers, they then had to back down the hill and turn into that side wadi where Uyethuya is located in order to turn around and then go back down the hill. This was causing a terrible bottleneck because there were often long lines of coaches coming into the valley. So the Antiquities Department was proposing to widen the road at that point to make a bus turnaround so that they could just make a big circle instead of having to back down the hill. We had known from early travelers' journals and from early maps of the sketch maps of the valley that there was a tomb in the very area where the department was planning to widen the roadway, and it was known as KV5. It had been seen by John Gardner Wilkinson, who had assigned it a number when he numbered the first 22 tombs in the Valley of the Kings back in the mid-19th century. And we thought if they're going to widen the road, there's a good chance they might damage KV5, or at least its entrance, and any other tombs that lie in the area as well. Let's see if we can't relocate KV5 so the Antiquities Department's road widening operation won't do any damage. And I went to the British Library and I looked through the journals of James Burton, who in the 1820s had visited KV5. That is to say, he had seen the entrance and was able to slither about 10 meters in through the front door. And I read his description of where the tomb entrance lay. It was a very vague description, but at least we could get an idea of which hillside it lay in. And we went over to that section of the Valley of the Kings, and I had our workmen dig a long trench along the base of the hill to see if we couldn't find the entrance to the tomb. And sure enough, after 2 days of digging a trench along the hill slope, we relocated the entrance to KV5. No big deal. And I thought, well, this is terrific. All we have to do is put the entrance on our plan, and we can go and do something else. But as we dug and began clearing the entrance, we discovered that although the tomb was indeed filled with rubble from 11 or so floods, as we later learned, from floods that had filled the tomb with debris, Burton and other early travelers had dug a channel through that debris so they could crawl into the first flood-filled rooms. We decided to take a look inside as well. And we crawled along that same channel that Burton, we think, had dug, a channel not much wider than my shoulders and only about 30 centimeters high. And we crawled in as far as we could go. We got exactly as far as Burton had gotten, which is to say about 10 or 15 meters. And we know it's as far as he got because looking up at the ceiling, we saw that Burton had written his name and the date in lampblack on the ceiling. That's where he stopped, turned around, and came out, after which in his journal he wrote basically that the tomb was undecorated, unimportant, uninteresting, and he went away. The tomb lay there for 100 years, and almost exactly 100 years later, Howard Carter saw that tomb, and he too crawled in and went no further than Burton did, and he too came out and said the tomb is of no interest whatever, and he used the area as a dumping ground for the debris from his excavations around Tutankhamun. It was conveniently located. The tomb, KV5, he thought had no interest to anyone at all, and so he simply buried the entrance. When we came along, we uncovered the entrance to KV5 again, removing, among other things, Howard Carter's debris. We too found the corridor, the channel that Burton had dug. We too crawled in, and we too thought the tomb was of no interest at all. But on the way out one day, we had been in the tomb once, had tried using probes to get some idea of the size of the chambers we were crawling through, and we had been able to do that in small chamber 1, small chamber 2, and the beginning of a big 16-pillared hall, which is chamber 3, which is where Burton had written his name on the ceiling. Crawling out of there, Catherine Rorig, who was with me, moved a couple of stones away from the wall, just at the entrance, the back side of the wall at the front of the tomb. And she found some hieroglyphs. Well, this was interesting. We didn't know the tomb was decorated. Everybody said there was nothing there. And so we had a couple of workmen come in, and Catherine and I watched while they began gradually, slowly clearing away debris, exposing more of the inscription on the front wall. And the inscription was the name and the title of Amenhotep, the firstborn son of Ramesses II. Well, suddenly KV5 took on considerable importance. And we thought, well, instead of just putting the entrance on our map and going away, we ought to do a little bit more clearing here and maybe find out the extent of the tomb. We know there are 2 small rooms and a 16-pillared hall. That's not much. We can clear that out in no time. Yankee ingenuity again. We began clearing the first chamber, but we found quickly that the flood-borne debris that filled that chamber had dried over the millennia to an almost cement-like consistency, and we had to go at it with picks. It was extremely difficult work. And yet embedded in that cement-like matrix were broken pieces of pottery, fragments of ushabtis, pieces of jewelry, and so forth. So while we were digging with our strongest workmen wielding picks, we had to have people constantly on watch to make sure they didn't damage any of the objects that they were finding in the debris. And of course, we had to measure them in because we thought very likely there would be a stratigraphic indication of the flood debris, the stages of flooding that had affected the valley. So we had to measure everything as well. That first chamber, instead of taking us a few hours or a few days to clear, actually wound up taking us an entire season. But what we discovered was that not only was Amenhotep recorded on the front wall of the tomb, another son was named on a side wall of that same chamber. In this case, it was Ramses, who we lovingly call Ramses Jr. to avoid confusion. The whole first chamber, in fact, had traces of decoration on its walls. This made KV5 a much more interesting operation than we had thought, and we decided we were going to have to slow down the survey work and devote much more time and, more importantly, money to clearing more of it to see if we could learn something more about it. In the process, we continued to clear Chamber 1, we continued clearing in Chamber 2, but we also went into Chamber 3, and although the crawl space in Chamber 3 was only about 50 centimeters high, and we had to slither on our bellies wherever we went, we did notice that there were a couple of doorways leading through the walls that defined that 16-pillared hall. We went to the back wall, found one of those doorways, which was cut low down on the wall. We cleared through and were able to crawl under the lintel of the doorway and into the room beyond. We thought, well, it's probably going to be a small side chamber, a storeroom, or what have you. It turns out to have been a corridor, more than 100 feet long, with, we counted 16 doorways leading into side chambers on both the left and the right side. Because the doorway leading into this corridor had been partially blocked by a very large stone that we had to remove before we could crawl through it, the flood debris in this long corridor was not as heavy or as thick as what we had encountered at the beginning of the tomb. We couldn't stand up, but at least we could crawl on our hands and knees instead of having to slither on our belly. And we went back 100 feet to the end of this corridor, and lo and behold, what did we see on the back wall but a figure, an Osiris figure, we thought. But, and I think Ray Johnson is right about this, the figure of Osiris wearing a Shebiu collar is probably a Shebiu necklace, is probably a representation of Ramses II in an Osirid form, in a sense standing there looking out protectively over the burial chambers that we now know occupied multiple sons of him and his various wives. Well, we also found, looking through the side doorways in this corridor, other corridors leading to the left and the right, each one of them 100 feet long, each one of them lined with other doorways. And suddenly we found that KV5 was not this tiny, undecorated, unimportant tomb, but it was already the largest tomb ever found in the Valley of the Kings. And during that time, we had gone from 3 little chambers, as were shown on Burton's sketch plan from the 19th century, to a tomb with at least 80 chambers in it. And it was at that point that the you-know-what hit the fan. The Antiquities Department, anxious for some PR, anxious to encourage tourism even more, encouraged us to do some publicity, and we worked with the Antiquities Department to arrange for a press announcement saying that we had found a tomb of multiple sons of one of Egypt's most powerful rulers, a tomb that is the largest ever found in the Valley of the Kings, 80 plus chambers at this point. And we agreed that there would be a simultaneous release to the press in New York and in Cairo. 7 hours difference between them, but they were both announced at the same time. Well, it was a slow news week, and the press just ate it up. Time magazine put it on the cover of their issue, devoted 6 pages, I think, of Time magazine to the discovery, long discussions about who Ramses was and so forth. It was on every news magazine you can think of. It was on television all over the world. The AUC, the university, hired a clipping service, and we have filled, we have filled folders with press clippings from magazines and newspapers all over the world, and those press clippings, which are still in my office, span a shelf that's about 5 feet long. It's just amazing. It changed our lives, needless to say. It took over the Theban Mapping Project. We had an obligation to clear more of it and to protect it. The press was clamoring for more. Everybody wanted to come. Hosni Mubarak flew down to come into the tomb and look at it. He only went in a little ways because he didn't want to get his black suit dirty, but he came in, visiting firemen, the president of Iceland, the president of France, the prime minister of Italy, one after the other, all came, and KV5 was on their must-see list. And so we had no alternative but to deflect much more effort to the cleaning and consolidation of the tomb than we had anticipated having to do in the past. That put a real burden on us financially, but the good news was that there were American companies with a presence in Egypt that were clamoring to give us money to help us do this excavation. They wanted, obviously, the credit. And we got $500,000 from Mobil Oil. I mean, they came and said, here, but we didn't even have to ask. And then I had met and had lunch with a guy named Bill Steer, who was CEO of Pfizer, who was out in Egypt, and he came by the tomb. And at the end of it, he just called Pfizer Cairo manager and said, write him a check, another $500,000. And I mean, we had plenty of money to do the work. We could hire more people to work in KV5, but we also could hire more people to continue the survey, continue the mapping. Had it not been for that, I think we might still be working on trying to get the volume of the Valley of the Kings out, because making a map is an expensive undertaking and its publication is expensive. So we continued working in KV5, clearing more chambers. Practically every day that we worked, we found another doorway and were able to probe through the narrow crawl spaces. We couldn't get into these chambers, but we could probe through the narrow crawl spaces to get some idea of their size. And over the next several years, the tomb continued to grow and grow and grow, not only on the same level, but we found corridors that were sloping steeply downward to other levels. And the whole thing began to resemble a parking garage where you had little units on one level and then a corridor going down, a ramp or a staircase going down to another level with corridors and chambers off of it, and then a third level with corridors going off of it. And gosh, at the last count, we're up to 130 chambers, and there's still no end in sight. The excavation goes slowly because it's still that horrible cement-like matrix that we have to go through. And embedded are still these delicate pieces of pottery and other objects, nearly all of them broken, embedded in this that we have to be careful to protect. And there are the traces of decoration on every wall. Sometimes the pieces of plaster on the wall are no bigger than a thumbnail, but they are traces of plaster nonetheless, and we have to be careful not to lose them. We want to protect them. The result has been a very, very slow progression, but I think we are now leaving, as we work forward, we're leaving behind probably the best protected, the most structurally sound tomb in the Valley of the Kings, with the best conserved wall decoration or fragments of wall decoration on it. We have so far found the names of 4 sons of Ramesses II. We have found 4 complete sets of canopic jars, the names on which are the same as the names that we have on the tomb walls. We have 4 skulls, 2 of which are with complete bodies. 2 skulls that may have washed into the tomb, may not, but we have 4 bodies, let's put it that way. The complete skeletons are of mummies. They're of adult males, probably around 40 or 50 years old. One of them may be Amenhotep. He was, after all, a general of the army, and this does show injuries to the skull and to the long bones that would be consistent with the kind of accidents or injuries that you might encounter on a battlefield. That's not a very strong argument, not a very compelling one, perhaps, but it's as good as we've got. We've tried craniofacial reconstruction on the bodies. The people who have done this in Britain have said that they have no doubt that these are children of Ramesses II. They share a number of craniofacial attributes with him. And they take the 4 skulls and they divide them into 2 groups and say that clearly these 2 are of Ramesses II and probably of the same mother. These 2, also of Ramesses II, are of the same mother but a different mother than the first set. Now, how much faith you can place in craniofacial reconstructions and identification is an open question. The FBI use it, but they don't have as much faith in it, obviously, as DNA. Whether we can do DNA testing at some point remains to be seen. Zahi has tried, but most people have very little faith in the DNA results that he's been getting because of the unfortunate, what's the word? They did not maintain the integrity of the samples, contamination, because of the contamination of the samples. Anyway, we are still working on KV5, and I think we probably will continue to work on KV5 because although we have 4 sons, it's entirely possible there are more. And we have 130 chambers, but there's an almost certainty that there are more. And our big problem is that this tomb is different from any other tomb in Egypt. There are no parallels to it in plan, or indeed as a family mausoleum. And in consequence, we're still very hard put to say how the tomb functioned. How do you divide this up into component parts? Are these 10 rooms the burial place of Amenhotep, or did he have all 50 rooms in that wing? Or perhaps Amenhotep was buried over here, or what have you. We now know that the tomb originally began life as a small 18th dynasty tomb. It follows the first 3 chambers, or the first 2 chambers and part of the third follow the plan, a very typical 18th dynasty cruciform tomb plan. But we think Ramesses II took that tomb in the valley and then elaborated upon it, in part because it lies so close to his own tomb. But beyond that, we're hard put to offer any explanations. And the only way we can, I think, learn the answers to any of these questions is to continue excavation. We have, however, thought anyway we had, completed an atlas of the Valley of the Kings. But now we are going back to do a 3rd edition, including tombs that have been excavated since our earlier atlas was published. Tombs excavated by the French, by the American mission of Don Ryan and Arce, by the Japanese, workmen's huts, workmen's quarters that were excavated by the Finnish mission and by another Swiss mission of Andreas Dorn. There's been a lot of work in the Valley of the Kings, which we want to include in a new edition of the Atlas. And we have updated our maps and plans of KV5, and we have also done a lot of additions to, added things to other tombs. Chambers in Merenptah, for example, that were filled with debris when we mapped that tomb, but which now are accessible. So we're doing a third edition. We still have an enormous amount of work to be done in KV5, but I'm pleased to say that the Atlas has come out in 2 editions, but unfortunately, more recently, there's been a lot of new material discovered in the Valley of the Kings. There are a lot of things that have been added, or that we should add to our Atlas of the Valley of the Kings to make it complete. And these include tombs that have been excavated by the Swiss, by a couple of American missions, by the Japanese and others. There have been workmen's huts cleared by the Finnish, by Andreas Dorn and others. Dr. Zahi has done some excavations both in the East Valley and currently in the West Valley. And to the extent, those have been covered over again, to the extent that there are notes that were taken of what he found, and they are by no means complete, but to the extent that there are notes, we will try to incorporate these as well. So we are planning on a third edition of the Atlas of the Valley of the Kings, and I'm hoping we can have that done, if not by the end of this year, then certainly by the spring of 2019. It's important that we do this in terms of future planning for the Valley of the Kings, because the Theban Mapping Project has as its first goal to make a map of Thebes, and we have concentrated so far on the Valley of the Kings. We have another obligation now imposed upon us, and that is to continue to clear and structurally safeguard KV5, to learn as much about it as possible, to publish what we have, and to make sure that the tomb is left when we finish in good, complete, safe condition. Those are obligations, but we have done other things as well in the valley, and we want to continue with these. We've done a lot of work in the valley to ensure that visitors have a more pleasant touristic experience, both to encourage tourism, because after all, the economy of Egypt depends heavily upon it, and at the same time to ensure that that tourism is safe and is not detrimental to the monuments. We put in signage in the Valley of the Kings. We put in new lighting in the valley. We put in walkways in the tombs. We put in security measures and so forth. All of these things to not diminish tourism, to make tourism more pleasant, but also to make sure that the tombs remain in good condition. This is an ongoing process. It's not something that we can do now and say, well, that's finished for an eternity, we can move on to other things. It's something that still requires work. There are still big problems with visitor management. What do you do when you get 9,000 tourists in the Valley of the Kings each day, as we were getting just before the Arab Spring a few years ago? That dropped dramatically, but it is now back on the rise again, and it's not going to be long before we're back to the 9,000 tourists a day figure. And when you get that many people, you've got to have a way of getting them safely into the tombs so they can appreciate what they are seeing, but look at it without doing any damage. We've got to control temperature, we've got to control humidity, we have to control tour numbers. And there's the big rub. Controlling tour numbers. We can't cut down on the numbers. All we can do is figure out how to get them in a way that does as little damage as possible. Temperature and humidity controls in the tomb are probably necessary. We've got to have more tombs that are open to the public in order to distribute people more broadly across the necropolis. But we can't cut down on the numbers or tourists won't come. And if tourists don't come, Egypt loses 15% of its hard currency income every year. That's just not going to work. And the local villagers lose 100% of their hard currency income, of their income generally every year. I don't think it's necessarily necessary to claim that tourism and conservation of monuments are incompatible. But if they are going to be compatible, they have to be subjected to a very carefully thought out and constantly monitored plan. And that's part of our work now. We're trying to take this same philosophy, this same approach to the monuments, and apply it, having now tested it in a sense in the Valley of the Kings, apply it to other parts of the Theban necropolis, and I hope to apply it more broadly to the major archaeological sites in Thebes, in Egypt generally. That's a big order, but at least we, the Theban Mapping Project, I think are in a position to provide some of the techniques that can be used we're in a position to develop management techniques, touristic management techniques that are replicable at other sites. And whether that means managing tourist numbers or doing effective lighting in tombs that is non-destructive or non-damaging to the reliefs, or doing proper signage or what have you. It's probably a combination of all of these things, and I think our goal with the TMP has to be to involve ourselves with all of these things. That's one of the reasons that we have established a library as part of the TMP's work in Luxor, a research library that is open free of charge to anybody 365 days a year, and open in the evenings so the inspectors of antiquity can come and make use of reference material that they otherwise do not have access to. Tour guides can come and hone their skills. Conservators, Egyptologists can come and do research while they're in the field. We're not competing with Chicago House. We are enhancing the value of Chicago House in a sense by reducing the pressure on them, but we are also making our materials available to everybody, whether they're tourists or not. And we have begun a program to educate the youth in the Luxor area to the importance of protecting the monuments. And that, I think, is probably the single most important thing our project is going to be doing. Taking young kids and training them to appreciate the monuments, to understand their value, to teach them a bit of Egyptian hieroglyphics so they can take pride and go out and point out, this is the name of so-and-so on the wall, this is Ramesses II, this is Thutmose III. Get them to go out in the field and say, look at, yes, these kind of insects, this is a praying mantis, it can be seen in the tomb of so-and-so. There's a continuity between the ancient Egyptians and us. We are all kindred spirits living in the same landscape, to build a relationship, a bond, if you will, between them. And it already is paying big dividends. We got 150 kids coming to our library, more than we can accommodate, every Friday, wanting to come in and learn hieroglyphs, learn a bit about Egyptian history, learn about conservation. It's very, very rewarding. Now, this isn't paying immediate dividends, but I think I can guarantee you that 10 or 15 years from now, when these kids grow up and are the antiquities sellers or the potential antiquities thieves or are the inspectors of antiquity or the tour guides in Luxor, they're going to remember what they learned at this time. And 10 or 15 years from now, you're going to have a generation of people responsible for the monuments who have a much more sympathetic understanding of the importance those monuments play in their life than has been the case in the past.